by PricewaterhouseCoopers shows that the top 3 concerns of American HR professionals are leadership development, change management, and succession planning. But there's another survey of employees identified as high potentials, which shows that 1/3 of them said they intend to jump ship within 1 year, and they admit to not putting in previous levels of effort into their jobs. This makes our jobs as a HR community much more critical than it ever has been in the past. Our speaker this morning, Ann Potts, believes that one of the best solutions to managing change, developing leaders, and retaining top talent is managerial courage, where leaders address problems, communicate honestly, and do what's right for the organization. Ann lives her life with energy, passion, and yes, courage, because she realizes each moment is precious. After nearly losing her ability to walk following a pretty significant car accident, she began to challenge her leadership approach. She was armed with a newfound inner strength and commitment to fully live her values. She became more successful than ever and also a key asset to her current employer. Ann has her own company, which she started in 2009, of executive coaching and consulting, and she uses her talents to create a positive impact on the business community. She has a background in Six Sigma Black Belt. She brings a fresh, energetic approach, and I think you will find her presentation today extremely interesting, and she will have time for questions at the end. So please let me welcome Ann Potts.
Thank you. Well, as Ellen said, we've got an interesting climate today, don't we, where you all are trying to work on leadership development and succession planning, and we've got people saying they're ready to jump ship. And then we've also got a millennial generation, which some of you may be part of, and that's great, but who's also challenging people because they want a different kind of leaders. And what surveys are showing of those folks, we're going to quote a lot of surveys right up front and get it out of the way, but they're saying that they want straight feedback, mentoring and coaching, and they want a company with strong values. So again, I think that leads us back to courage being a common denominator for all of those employee needs, because how do we re-engage people who are thinking about leaving? It's by creating the culture, which of course Marie was talking about, what a great culture they have at the Blackhawks. And I think to institute a culture like that, as you heard her, she didn't really talk about courage, but I think there had to be a lot of courage being shown them, because obviously they had to turn over a lot of people, bring in new people, and that really requires a strong vision and values and leading from a place of courage. So we're going to talk about that more today. I think another thing that I'd just like to share up front before we jump in is this quote. I was listening to this interview recently with an employment attorney, and he was talking about what is it that he commonly sees when people actually go to the extreme of a lawsuit. And he said that many times they want to be heard. And in many cases, the right to be heard is more important to them than any particular dollar figure. And he further went on to say that misunderstandings take on a life of their own. So he was really talking about how often he thought things could have been stopped earlier in the cycle. And he talked a lot about mediation because he's a professional mediator, and he talked about ombuds programs. And that interested me because in my last W-2 job, I was actually an ombuds person for my organization. And I don't know how many of you have that kind of a program, but it really was another source of somebody that people could go to if they weren't satisfied with how their manager was handling things, or their manager's manager in some cases. And I would get involved in research and help mediate it, and try to keep it from escalating any further, which probably to most of you in this room sounds exactly like your job, right? And that really, most of the time, it did go to HR, not to an ombuds person. But you would have these cases where people felt, they wanted somebody who was totally removed and who they felt was more objective. And I don't think it'll surprise anybody here that what I found about 90% of the time was there was a communication failure in the process, that the manager, in most cases, had been talking to the employee, but again, the employee did not feel heard. And I think one of the attributes of courage we don't talk about a lot is the courage to listen. the courage to just be present and say, tell me more about what you're thinking or what you're feeling, and not to jump in with a solution. Because we all have solutions, right? You know, we've got our scripts and our boundaries, and okay, here's how you solve it. But in a lot of cases, what people really needed was to feel heard, and once they felt heard, then they could listen to the other side. What was ironic was in some of the cases I got involved with, the manager's manager was also aware of the situation, and in one case that was memorable, had told the manager, you know, don't go too far with this thing because you might be opening up a can of worms. Well, what ended up happening, you know, by not addressing it up front, there was more of a can of worms because the employee ended up coming to an ombudsperson. There ended up being more time, more effort, when it probably could have been resolved right up front. So we're going to talk today about what courage is, why it matters, the state of it in your organization, and how you can help advance it. And I do apologize, I think we have a fuller room than we anticipated, so we may, not everybody may have a handout, but you'll be able to work around that. So let's look at a quote from a book called The Courage to Act. And the author of this book calls courage the turbocharging required to succeed when it isn't enough to choose what's easy, self-indulgent, or politically expedient. It's a personal choice. We don't show courage when we're doing the right thing under duress or because higher-ups are monitoring our compliance, but when we choose to rise to a challenge out of our own free will and sense of honor. So to me, that really pulls out this fact that it is values-based, that you're really coming from a place of integrity and choice and standing up for what you believe is right. And again, as we just talked, this sounds very lofty, you know, when it refers to challenge. And some of the challenges you have may sound small in scale, but I think some of the smaller scale challenges, like two employees who don't get along and the drama that can ensue with that, some of those situations take a tremendous amount of courage to deal with. When I think about courage, and I have given it some thought over the years, I really see four elements that are often at play. I think that the first is there's the willingness to take a risk, because being courageous does mean you are going to disrupt the status quo. As Marie told us downstairs in her keynote, you know, it sounded like they really went through some house cleaning. And that takes courage to do. It takes courage to tell somebody that they aren't performing, or, you know, guide them to another position. And you really have to be coming from that place of integrity, of doing what is right. And so that, again, links back to what I was talking about before with having vision and values and being really clear about what those are. And although we know organizations often have values posted, it's also coming from your own place of values as well. Candor, obviously, I think that is a huge piece of courage. You really have to be ready to be honest. And sometimes that is painfully honest. It's really a directness that really kind of, you know, requires you to just, you know, feel it in your gut and go forward. And willingness, the willingness to own decisions. So we are going to talk a little bit more about your organizations, but I'd just like to see a bit of a show of hands right now, because I think we have people from various sizes of organizations. How many are in an organization where there's 25 or less employees? Okay, a couple. How about 100 or less? How about 100 to 250? Okay. So, and are the rest of you 250 and above? Okay, great. So you're dealing with some bigger organizations as well. So we've probably got a full gamut here of the kinds of issues people are experiencing depending on the size of their organization. If you're in a very small organization, you may be dealing with a business owner, and that may be one of your real challenges, to be courageous with them. But you know, a bigger organization obviously has its own challenges. Let me tell you a story about something that happened in my past where I really saw all of these elements come to play. I was in a larger organization, and a few years into my management career, I had been a first-line manager for about 3 years. I began to report to a different manager. Her name was Judy, and she came from Connecticut and moved to our Illinois office. And she was there about 6 months before we got into the salary planning cycle. And it came time for merit increases, and we were told that the average increase was going to be 3% that year, which, by the way, sounds pretty good now, doesn't it? I don't think we thought it sounded so good then, but right now that sounds pretty good. And so the first pass we always did in salary planning was to try and work on what we felt our individual work groups should get as a salary. So each of us did our worksheet and submitted it to Judy. And she called us together, and her first act of courage was to challenge the status quo, because she saw when she looked at what we had submitted that even though we had a lot of discretion of what to do, nobody had gone less than 2% or more than 4%. So we had a 3% average, and we had a really tight span in which we were working, and I think you all know exactly why we were doing that. So her first question to us was, you know, what's this about? I know that we have like these 5 people at least who I think are really exceptional. Why are they only getting a 4% raise? They're really the lifeblood of this organization, and they're holding us together. And by the way, our salary planning guidelines say you can go up to 6%. So why aren't they getting that? Well, you know, there's a little bit of squirming right in the room. And obviously the answer was because we would have to balance it at the other end of the scale. And that's the piece, you know, even more than our good employees who we wanted to reward, there was the lack of courage of wanting to have some difficult conversations, because to balance that, you were going to have to go pretty low. The next thing she really did to disrupt the status quo was she said, I think we really need to look at balancing this at my level, not at each of your levels. Well, that just wasn't how we had done things in Chicago. It probably was how we should have been doing them, but it was not how we had done them. So again, she was challenging us from how we looked at things. So at that point, she also told us she did not think there was an exactly equal talent distribution among our work groups, which of course there never is, right? So we actually had to get together, and we really had to come together in integrity, saying that, all right, we really believe in the organizational value, which, by the way, was paid for performance, right? I'm sure you've all got, or many of you probably have that as a key value. And we had to talk honestly about our people, and not from that competitive point that sometimes managers get into when they get in those situations, because, you know, you're kind of jockeying about my team or this or that. But really having the courage to be honest about who was cutting it, who was a superstar, who wasn't, and really coming to that balance as an organization. So obviously Judy ended up balancing at the 3% level, but not each team did. Some teams were higher, some were lower. I think there were a couple that came in pretty close to the 3%. But then the next phase, of course, came in, which was having to have some of those difficult conversations where you tell somebody that they're going to get, you know, a very minimal increase that year. So that was an example where I saw in my career of a leader really asking her managers to step into being more courageous. And again, we weren't even stepping outside the system of what the system said we could do or should do, but nobody had challenged it before. I'd like to hear from you why you think courage matters. And I'll capture some of these up here. So why do you think courage matters? Why would it be better if your organization were more courageous? Or maybe it wouldn't. You're just here just in case.
It's more profitable.
Yeah. You want to expand on why you think it's more profitable?
Well, if you have people that have the courage to take risks, risk-taking in and of itself will give you greater gains. It also builds that trust, which you have to have in order to, again, be more profitable.
Yeah, great. How about anybody else? Yeah.
I think it can definitely improve performance and develop employees if you're willing to be honest with them on what they really need to do to improve, or they need more help.
I think you're right. Yeah, without truth, you can't really grow, right? None of us are perfect. What else?
It's more ethical.
More ethical, yeah, it's that integrity, right? It's not always easy, but usually you do feel better about yourself.
I think as an HR professional, you can live with yourself at night if you step up to the plate with courage.